In this video, we're gonna talk about basal nuclei or the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia or basal nuclei are a group of subcortical nuclei which are situated at the base of the forebrain and top of the midbrain. The basal ganglia are strongly interconnected with cerebral cortex, thalamus, and brain stem, as well as several other brainstem areas. The basal ganglia are associated with a variety of functions, including control of voluntary motor movements, procedural learning, habit learning, eye movements, cognition, and emotion. In other words, basal nuclei are applied to a collection of masses of gray matter situated within each cerebral hemisphere. They are paired, as you see, they are paired and located between thalamus, here is the thalamus, and the white matter. And the basal nuclei consists of 5 pairs of nuclei, which include caudate nucleus. This is the caudate, head of caudate nucleus. Here you see the tail of the caudate nucleus. Then the putamen, this is the putamen. And the globus pallidus. Globus means globe, pallidus means pale, light in color. And then the substantia nigra, which we don't see it here, and the subthalamic nucleus, we don't see it either on this picture. Okay, let's review this basal nuclei again here. This is the head of caudate nucleus here. This is the putamen, globus pallidus, which has an external or lateral and an internal or medial part. And down here, the subthalamic nucleus in red and the substantia nigra in black. So, again, these 5 pairs of nuclei form the basal nuclei. And the caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, externus, internus. Here is the subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra. Now let's review the anatomy around this basal ganglia. Now look at this one. There is a structure here. This is a white matter. Part of the white matter, this internal capsule. We're gonna talk about the internal capsule in detail here. And here is the thalamus. Look at here, the thalamus. Here is down here is the hypothalamus. Thalamus superiorly and the hypothalamus inferiorly surrounds the third ventricle. Here is the third ventricle. This is the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle has an anterior horn, posterior horn, and the inferior horn. This is the anterior horn, or in other words, the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle has also a posterior horn, which is also known as the occipital horn, located inside the occipital lobe. The lateral horn has also an inferior or the temporal horn, which is located inside the temporal lobe. The reason I am talking about the lateral ventricle and its horns, because they have a close relation with the hypothalamic nucleus. The hypothalamic nucleus, also the basal especially with the basal nuclei. And also we're gonna talk about the internal capsule, because internal capsule also has a close relation with the basal ganglia. Okay, now you see the basal ganglia here. This is the globe. Here is the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus. Its head, its body, and the tail. This is the amygdala. This amygdala has connection with the caudate nucleus, and from outside the inside, there is the caudate nucleus, the putamen, then the globus pallidus, and then the thalamus. Okay, this is the internal capsule. So the internal capsule, a white matter structure, is a unique location where a large number of motor and sensory fibers travel to and from the cortex. It is one of the subcortical structures of the forebrain, and other subcortical structures are caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, thalamus, and brain stem. And as you see here, this is the motor or sensory homunculus. So certain part of the sensory or motor homunculus receive information or send its impulse through certain part of the internal capsule. For example, the efferents arising from the motor homunculus run down through the gene of the internal capsule. So let's look at the internal capsule in detail. Here is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Here is the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Here is the gene of the internal capsule. As you see here, there is a close association between the basal nuclei and the internal capsule. So the anterior limb of the internal capsule separates head of caudate nucleus from the putamen and the globus pallidus. Look at here. Here is the posterior limb of the internal capsule, which separates globus pallidus and putamen from the thalamus. And in this picture, we see the efferent or the descending pathways passing through the internal capsule. So the frontopontine and other cortical fibers run down through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Look at here. The fibers going to the face and head of the body, this is an descending pathway or efferent pathway. In this case, this is the corticobulbar tract, run through the gene of the internal capsule. And corticopontine and other corticofugal fibers and subthalamic radiation, including somatosensory radiation, and also the corticospinal tract run down through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And Here is the auditory radiation. It's also known as inferior thalamic pentangle, originates from the medial geniculate nucleus inside the medial geniculate body. Here is the optic radiation, is also known as posterior thalamic pentangle, which originates or arises from the lateral geniculate nucleus inside the lateral geniculate body. Now, lateral geniculate nucleus is about vision, reflexes, or visual reflexes. Medial geniculate nucleus is about hearing or audition. Okay, here is the caudate nucleus, the head, body, and tail of the caudate nucleus, and we group the basal nuclei in subgroups. Look at here. Again, the basal ganglia include caudate nucleus, head of caudate nucleus. Here is the putamen, and the globus pallidus, its external segment or lateral segment, its internal segment or the medial segment. Here is the subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra. Okay, now putamen, here is the putamen and the globus pallidus. Together forms the lendiform nucleus, or lendiform nucleus is divided into putamen and the globus pallidus. Globus pallidus means pale globe because it is lighter in color compared to putamen. That's why it's called globus pallidus. And caudate nucleus this is the head of caudate nucleus here. It is its tail, and the putamen form the striatum. The striatum here. And all of these nuclei here, I mean the caudate nucleus, putamen, and the globus pallidus make up the corpus striatum. Now, the largest component of the basal ganglia is the corpus striatum, which include the dorsal and ventral striatum, receive input from many brain areas beyond the basal ganglia, but only sends output to other components of the basal ganglia, not other sides of the brain. That's an important feature of the corpus striatum. Okay, this is another slide showing us the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei consists of caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra. Caudate nucleus and putamen together make up the striatum. The putamen and globus pallidus together make up the lenticular nucleus. So the lenticular nucleus plus the striatum make up the corpus striatum. Okay, now let's continue with the striatum. The striatum is a subcortical structure generally divided into the dorsal striatum, which contains the caudate nucleus and the putamen, and the ventral striatum that includes the nucleus accumbens. We don't see it here, and the olfactory tubercle. We don't see this also on this picture, but we will have a picture showing these two structures. So it is important to note that the neurons in the striatum project to the external or lateral globus pallidus here, and internal or medial globus pallidus, as well as the substantia nigra parsoreticulata. And the neurons inside the striatum are GABAergic neurons. They use GAB or the GABA as neurotransmitter. The projections into the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra are primarily dopaminergic. Okay, here you see the olfactory tubercle is here, olfactory tubercle is here, and the nucleus accumbens is also here. So these are the ventral striatum, and the dorsal striatum includes the putamen and the globus pallidus. Here there is also the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, amygdala. Okay, we see the basal nuclei with the nucleus accumbens, globus pallidus, putamen, head of caudate, body of caudate, and tail of caudate nucleus, and the thalamus, which has a very close relation or association with the basal nuclei. Okay, we continue to the striatum. So the dorsal striatum receives significant glutaminergic inputs from the cortex, as well as dopaminergic inputs from the substantia nigra pars compacta. The dorsal striatum is generally considered to be involved in sensory motor activities in the brain. And the caudate nucleus has three primary regions of connectivity, with the head of the caudate here, demonstrating connectivity to the prefrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, and the amygdala. And the striatopallidal fibers connect the striatum to the pallidus. Again, we group the basal nuclei in the striatum, landiform nucleus. Together they make up the corpus striatum. Now, phylogenetically, our basal nuclei divided into three areas in terms of where they belong. Now, the amygdaloid body belongs to the oldest part of the brain, the archestriatum. The globus pallidus belongs to the paleostriatum of the brain, which develops right after the development of the archestriatum. And the putamen and the caudate nucleus pertain to the neostriatum. That is the newly developing part of the brain. Okay, now let's review the basal nuclei on this brain section. Here is the lateral ventricle, its anterior horn, and they're separated by the septum pellucidum. Here is the corpus callosum, and Here we see the thalamus is here. Here is the thalamus. We see the internal capsule, the lentiform nucleus, again the lentiform nucleus. Just outside the lentiform nucleus, this white area is the external capsule. Outside external capsule, there is a gray area here, which is the claustrum. We don't know its function very well, but it is well developed in cows, sheep, and goats. And outside the claustrum, there is another white area. It's called the extreme capsule. Here is again the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. Here is again the lateral ventricle is continuous. Down here, the posterior or occipital horn of the lateral ventricle. This is the thalamus here, thalamus. And here is the caudate, head of caudate nucleus. Down here, the tail of the caudate nucleus. Here is the internal capsule, the white area, internal capsule. And the thalamus, you see, the thalamus. Here we see the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So it separates globus pallidus, putamen from the thalamus. Again, here is the putamen. The darker area is the putamen. Slightly lighter area is the globus pallidus. Just outside the putamen, there is the external capsule. Outside the external capsule, the gray area is the claustrum. Outside the claustrum, this white area, it is the extreme capsule. Okay, so phylogenetical areas represented by different components of basal nuclei. Again, the corpus striatum consists of caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. Lentiform nucleus is made by putamen and the globus pallidus. Again, the amygdala and the claustrum belong to the archistriatum. Globus pallidus belongs to pallidum or the palliastratum, and the putamen and the caudate nucleus is part of the neostratum. Now let's review the basic functions of the basal nuclei that we have been talking about here. So the activity of the basal nuclei starts by information received from sensory cortex, thalamus, substantia nigra, and red nucleus, according to thoughts of mind. So this information is integrated within corpus striatum and channeled within globus pallidus and outflow back to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex and also other motor areas in the brain stem. Therefore, the basal nuclei can control muscular movement through its effect on cerebral cortex here. Subsequently, basal nuclei assist in regulation of voluntary movement and learning of motor skills. Now, the basal nuclei involve in designing of plans, which convert thoughts and ideas into motor actions in order to produce a coordinated, organized, purposeful movement, like dressing, like painting, or drawing, or writing, or playing a musical instrument. The basal nuclei also involves in determining the timing and scale of movement, in which to what extent the movement will be fast and how long it will last. These features are very important to perform a smooth and determined movement. And also the basal ganglia also store motor programs of familiar motor actions like signature, like riding a bicycle or riding a horse, driving a car. All these information are stored in the basal ganglia. And also, so the basal ganglia are associated with a variety of functions, including voluntary motor control, procedural learning relating to routine behaviors or habits such as gnashing of teeth, eye movements, and cognitive and emotional functions. Moreover, basal nuclei are shown to function in action selection. That is the decision of which of several possible behaviors to execute at a given time. And ultimately, basal ganglia exert an inhibitory influence on a number of motor systems, and that a release of this inhibition permits a motor system to become active. Okay, now let's look at the each component of the basal nuclei in detail. Now let's start with the caudate nucleus. As you see, the caudate nucleus here is taken out. It is inside the brain. So as you see, caudate nucleus is a large C-shaped or comma-shaped mass of gray matter. Lies in close relation with the lateral ventricle. It has three parts: the head, the body, and the tail. Again, here is the head, body, and tail of the caudate nucleus. And you see the tail of the caudate nucleus is connected to the amygdaloid nucleus. Again, this is the putamen here. So the putamen and the head of caudate nucleus is almost at the same level in the brain. This is the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. Okay, the same type of information here is again, here is the head of caudate nucleus, but it is nice to see the accumbens nucleus here. You see the relation between the head of caudate nucleus and the accumbens nucleus. You may hear accumbens nucleus in several different places. So here is the accumbens nucleus. Head, body, and tail of the caudate nucleus. Here is the medial or inner segment, and this is the lateral or external segment of the globus pallidus. Now we see the caudate nucleus here. This is a horizontal brain section or the transverse brain section. Here we see this is the caudate, mainly the head of caudate nucleus. This is the, look at this, is nice, this is the putamen. And here is the white globe, the globus pallidus. And here we can see the external capsule and the claustrum, then the extreme capsule. Here we see the thalamus. Here is the thalamus. Now, the head of caudate nucleus is a large, rounded part of the nucleus, and it forms the lateral wall of anterior horn of lateral ventricle. And it continues inferiorly with the putamen of landiform nucleus. The body of the caudate nucleus is long, narrow, and continues with the head at the interventricular foramen. There is interventricular foramen which connects two lateral ventricles to the third ventricle in the brain. And it forms part of the floor of the body of the lateral ventricle here. The tail of the caudate nucleus is long, narrow, and lies in the roof of inferior horn of lateral ventricle, or the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. It is connected anteriorly with the amygdaloid nucleus here. Now, this is a nice drawing showing us the relation between the basal nuclei. Look at here. This is the caudate nucleus. So we're looking at the basal nuclei from the lateral view, from the outside. So the caudate nucleus and the putamen are almost at the same level. And then inside to the putamen, there is the lateral part of the globus pallidus, and inside to the lateral part, there is the medial part of the globus pallidus. Then there is the thalamus. Then there is the third ventricle. If you start moving from inside to outside at the level of the diencephalon, so you start out from the third ventricle outside, just lateral to the third ventricle, there is the thalamus, then the globus pallidus medial part, lateral part of globus pallidus, and then the putamen, almost at the same level, but anteriorly you have the caudate nucleus, head of caudate nucleus, posteriorly the tail of caudate nucleus. Now here is the subthalamic nucleus. Subthalamic nucleus is right here, and the substantia nigra. Remember, substantia nigra is part of the mesencephalon with the red nucleus, substantia nigra. They are located inside the mesencephalon. But upper part of the substantia nigra and nucleus project into the diencephalon, especially in the subthalamus. Again, we see the caudate nucleus here. The body is association with the putamen. The head of the caudate nucleus, and it's inferiorly continues with the putamen. Deep to the putamen, there is the lateral or external globus pallidus. Here is the internal or medial globus pallidus, substantia nigra, nucleus ruber or the red nucleus, and the nucleus subthalamicus or the subthalamic nucleus. Here is the thalamus. And you see the associations between this gray matter or the gray matter areas or the nuclei. Now, let's continue with the connections of corpus striatum. Now, what afferent fibers or input or the inputs the corpus striatum receive? Well, it receives corticostriate fibers from all parts of the cerebral cortex, mostly from sensory and motor cortex. In other words, from the primary sensory and primary motor cortex, which are from the precentral and postcentral gyri. The axons pass the caudate nucleus and putamen, and the corticostriate fibers use glutamate as neurotransmitter. And corpus striatum receives also inputs from the thalamus through the thalamostriate fibers from this thalamus. From intralaminar nuclei of thalamus, axons pass the caudate nucleus here, and also the putamen to here. Now, corpus striatum also receives afferent fibers from the striatum. These fibers are called nigrostriate fibers. Axons from substantia nigra of midbrain pass the caudate nucleus here, and then putamen. And nigrostriate fibers use dopamine as neurotransmitter. Now, there are also afferent fibers coming from the brain stem. They ascend from brain stem, and they terminate in caudate nucleus and the putamen, and they use serotonin as neurotransmitter. Okay, we continue to the afferent fibers to the corpus striatum. So there are striatopallidal fibers. As their name indicate, they arise from the globus pallidus and the striatum. So these fibers pass from striatum, caudate nucleus, and putamen, the globus pallidus. We got here from caudate nucleus, putamen to the globus pallidus. And these striatopallidal fibers use gamma-aminobutyric acid, or the GB, as a neurotransmitter. And there are also striatonigral fibers. These fibers pass from striatum to substantia nigra. Some fibers in this striatonigral fibers use KB as neurotransmitter, and others use substance B. Now let's talk about the lendiform nucleus. We have actually talked about lendiform nucleus and how it is formed. Well, this lendiform nucleus is a mass of gray matter, wedge-shaped or biconvex lens. It has two capsules. One is the external capsule located laterally, external capsule, which separates lentiform nucleus from the claustrum here. And there is the internal capsule located medially. So the internal capsule separates lentiform nucleus from the caudate nucleus anteriorly, from the thalamus posteriorly. Again, so the internal capsule separates lentiform nucleus laterally from the caudate nucleus, the caudate nucleus, and the thalamus. The external capsule right here, this tiny white area, white matter, is the external capsule which separates lentiform nucleus from the claustrum. We know that the lentiform nucleus contains the putamen, which is this one here, which is larger, darker lateral portion of the lentiform nucleus. Well, this is the lentiform nucleus again here. This is the lentiform. The lentiform comes from the lens, like the lens, okay? And the globus pallidus, this part is the globus pallidus. There is the putamen. The globus pallidus means pale globe. As you see, it's smaller, lighter, medial portion of the lentiform nucleus. Inferiorly, putamen is continuous. Look at here is the putamen. Inferiorly, putamen is continuous with the head of caudate nucleus. The pallidum. The pallidum consists of the globus pallidus, means pale globe, and also the ventral pallidum. Now let's talk about the globus pallidus in detail. As you see here, globus pallidus, or the pale globe, has two segments. One is the internal or medial segment. This internal or the medial segment is commonly known as GPI. Look at it, GPI means internal globus pallidus, internal globus pallidus. Now pay attention to this usage, because we're gonna use this one later in our basal ganglia slides. Again, the GPI stands for internal globus pallidus. Now, it has also a larger external or lateral segment, and this is commonly shortened as GPE, means external globus pallidus. Now, both segments are functionally distinct parts and contain primarily KBergic neurons, which therefore have inhibitory effects on their targets. So this is important. So both segments of the globus pallidus inhibit or deactivate their targets, or inhibit their targets. Now the GPE, this one here, GPE, receives input mainly from the striatum and projects to the subthalamic nucleus. And moreover, the GPI receives signal from the striatum via the direct and indirect pathways. Now, the ventral pallidum is part of the pallidum. Now, let's talk about the Substantia nigra. Substantia nigra is a mesencephalon gray matter portion of the basal ganglia. Similar to Globus pallidus, Substantia nigra has also two parts. One is the pars compacta. Pars compacta is here. This is also abbreviated as SNC. SNC means the pars compacta, or the Substantia nigra pars compacta. And outer part of the Substantia nigra is the pars radiculata, commonly used or shown as SNR. So the posterior part of the Substantia nigra is the pars compacta, and anterior part of the Substantia nigra is the pars radiculata. So we use this as Substantia nigra pars compacta and Substantia nigra pars radiculata. Now the SNR often works in unison with GPI, and the SNR GPI complex inhibits the thalamus. So again, the SNR GPI complex inhibits the thalamus. Substantia nigra pars compacta here, however, produces the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is a very significant neurotransmitter in maintaining or sustaining balance in the striatal pathway. Okay, so there is a transverse section taken through the level shown here. This is the normal Substantia nigra. But in certain neurological diseases like Parkinson's disease, the neurons producing dopamine die out. So you see in here, there is a diminished Substantia nigra, mainly the dopaminergic neurons. Okay, now let's look at the connections of the Substantia nigra. First, we'll look at the afferents of the Substantia nigra. Most come from the neostriatum. Most come from the neostriatum. Most of the afferent fibers terminate in SNPR, but some of them also end in SNPC, which is not shown here. Now let's look at the efferents of the Substantia nigra. Pars compacta contains dopaminergic neurons. Look at it. Pars compacta contains the dopaminergic neurons. And afferents arising from SNPC terminate in the neostriatum. Okay, the Substantia nigra efferents pars reticularis contains GABAergic neurons, and the efferents arising from the SNPR here terminate in the thalamus, superior colliculus, tegmental nucleus, and the pedunculopontine nucleus. Look at the superior colliculus, the thalamus. Now let's talk about the subthalamic nucleus. Here is the subthalamic nucleus here. The subthalamic nucleus is a diencephalic gray matter portion of the basal ganglia, and the only portion of the ganglia that produces an excitatory neurotransmitter, the glutamate. So this is important to understand the function of the subthalamic nucleus. So the role of the subthalamic nucleus here is to stimulate the SNR GPI complex. In other words, Substantia nigra pars reticulata and the globus, internal globus pallidus complex. And it is part of the indirect pathway. We cannot talk about what the direct and indirect pathway that activate or inactivate the cerebral cortex. The subthalamic nucleus receives inhibitory input from the external part of the globus pallidus and sends excitatory input to the GPI. Now here we see the afferents to the subthalamic nucleus. So the afferents to the subthalamic nucleus come from external globus pallidus, from centromedian nucleus, the nucleus, parafascicular nucleus, and tegmental nucleus, pedunculopontine nucleus. Here is the centromedian and the parafascicular nucleus, and also the pedunculopontine nucleus. So the subthalamic nucleus receives inputs from the external globus pallidus, centromedian parafascicular complex, tegmental nucleus, and also from the pedunculopontine nucleus. Now let's look at the efferents of the subthalamic nucleus. So the subthalamic nucleus sent information to GPE and GPI. You can see it here, to GPI and GPE, to Substantia nigra. Look at here, Substantia nigra, pars compacta and pars reticulata, and also to pedunculopontine nucleus. And what you see here, the color of the efferents indicate what type of neurotransmitter they use. So the blue indicates that they use glutamate as a neurotransmitter, and the black indicates GABA and acetylcholine and dopamine. Okay, now let's look at the subthalamic nucleus and its efferents and the afferents. Now the subthalamic nucleus, its afferents come from the anterior cingulate cortex, prefrontal cortex and frontal eye field, from the primary motor cortex. But subthalamic nucleus projects to or sends its efferents to GPE, GPI, to GPI for motor functions, to SNR for oculomotor cognition, to ventral pallidum for behavioral and emotional activities. Now we're gonna look at connections and control of basal nuclei in another video.